Hey, this is Blighted Pine Books, and today we're going to be taking a look at the three Theban plays by the Greek playwright Sophocles. All right, so just a little bit of background on Sophocles if you're not already familiar with the dude. He is an ancient Greek playwright. He's writing about 2,500 years ago. He was born in around 497 BC and died around 405 BC. He is one of three playwrights who actually had plays survive. That's including Aeschylus and Euripides, who were his contemporaries. He wrote more than 120 plays, but only 7 of them actually survived. And he's celebrated as, one of the most famous playwrights of all time. He wrote these dramatic compositions that were infamous in the city-state of Athens. His plays were held at competitions during the Dionysia, which was an ancient Greek festival, and he often won first or second place. And he is known for adding a third actor into his plays, in addition to the role of the chorus. All right, so just a note on why I read this book. If you don't already know, I'm a teacher in the state of Tennessee, public school teacher, and we are required to teach from a pretty prescriptive curriculum. And the curriculum is distilled from this textbook called My Perspectives. And due to concerns with test scores in Hamilton County, the district has now pushed this 100% fidelity to curriculum thing. And one of the key texts this year, or the non-negotiable text, was Oedipus the King. It's also worth noting that I wasn't really looking forward to teaching this play. I probably wouldn't have selected it myself. Whenever I teach tragedy, I really like to teach August Wilson's Fences. It's one of my favorite plays of all time. And I'm also from Pittsburgh, which is the hometown of August Wilson. So I went into this play a little bit hesitant, but as I began teaching it, I became increasingly curious about Sophocles as a playwright, and I remembered that I had this copy of the three Theban plays lying around, and at some point I had thought it a good idea to read it. So I decided to, as I was teaching Oedipus the King, to read the other two plays, Antigone and Oedipus at Colonus. So in the end, I became increasingly curious about some of the philosophical ideas in Sophocles and how they shaped Western society and culture. And now I find him to be a kind of like a bedrock thinker whose influence has resonated all throughout Western culture. And therefore, one will engage with his ideas whether they want to or not. So I read these plays out of order. First, I read Oedipus the King because I had to teach it, and then I don't know why I decided that I would read Oedipus at Colonus next because that's where Oedipus dies. So essentially, I read them in chronological order, at least the chronology of the story, and then I finally finished with Antigone, which is after Oedipus is dead and his 2 sons are battling over the throne, and et cetera, et cetera. So I started off with Oedipus the King, and if you don't already know, it's the most infamous of the 3 plays and one of the most well-known plays in the Western canon. So well-known that most readers know something about the play before they sit down to read it, and that's often through an exposure to foundational psychologist Sigmund Freud and his Oedipus complex. So in my classroom, I decided that I was like, all right, guys, I'm going to spoil this story for you. So I kind of treated them as if they were Athenians who were attending the Dionysia. And I was, to be honest, I was a little bit surprised by their lack of prior knowledge. Almost none of my students had ever heard about Oedipus. Maybe there's not much about him on TikTok. So interestingly, this play takes place after all of the major drama has gone down, after the infant Oedipus was left in the woods with his ankles pierced, after he incidentally murders in self-defense King Laius, his father, in the place where 3 roads meet, and after an episode of chariot-era road rage, quotes John Green, and even after Oedipus weds his mother Jocasta and fathers 4 children with her. And it's interesting that there's this great John Green crash course video I ended up showing to my completely disinterested students about the significance of the role of fate in this play and how Sophocles doesn't stage a debate about fate versus free will. And I thought that was one of the coolest parts about this play. It's not like heavy-handed or moral or anything, but rather it's about fate and free will. It's not a play about what happened in the past, but rather about how we react to and handle what is happening currently and what has already happened in the past. And interestingly, Oedipus's reaction is kind of morally ambiguous. When he berates the blind prophet Tiresias for claiming that Oedipus has murdered his own father and having wed his mother, his anger is, pretty understandable. And when he seems blind to the obvious Occam's razor of the situation that, he had married his mother, that is the fact of his situation, it's understandable that someone would refuse to accept this, at least at the outset, given just how terrible it is, and the fact that he's devoted his entire life to avoiding his totally unfair and horrific destiny. So in the end, I thought this play was really cool because it presents this complex portrait of the human condition, that there are all these external factors we can't control, our genetics and our parents and our IQ and our geography, our class, our predispositions to disease and psychiatric disorders, family illness and death, and the general chaos of the universe, etc. All this stuff wreaks havoc over our lives, and no one is the wiser in a society that pressures women and men into conforming into standards of success that are statistically available to a remarkable few. However, it does take a close reading and imaginative analysis to really get all this out of the play, given the fact that it's so short and its lack of character complexity, at least relative to what we're used to from more modern storytelling. So the second play is titled Oedipus at Colonus, and it features Oedipus at Colonus, which is it's a small town outside of the city-state of Athens. This was my least favorite of the three plays, and it picks up maybe some time after Oedipus leaves off, but now Oedipus is significantly older. He's blind, if you don't know. He's haggard and pretty world-weary. His sons are in a real state. They are torn in a dispute over Thebes, born out of a poor decision to transfer leadership annually. And they have also been fated, but they have been fated to murder one another in battle. And Oedipus is pretty nihilistic about the situation and his own son's lack of integrity. So he's been wandering around the woods for years with his daughters at his side, and he's become hopelessly reliant on them as his eyes and a source of worldly comfort amidst all this suffering and meaninglessness. So Oedipus arrives at Colonus, again, it's this village outside of Athens that's apparently sacred to the Furies. It's also worth noting that I didn't really know anything about the Furies until a couple years ago when I played this awesome video game called Hades. And the Furies are amongst my favorite fights in this awesome game, and it's entirely based on Greek mythology. It's like a roguelike dungeon crawler game where the objective is to escape Hades, and it's just it's an awesome game, and you should play it. Anyhow, he's with his favorite daughter in this place that is sacred to the Furies, Antigone, and she's pretty much looking for a proper burial ground for him. And Oedipus learns that wherever he is buried is going to become a sacred burial ground and protective to whatever city is nearby. And so Creon, his brother-in-law and uncle, as my students like to point out, shows up to drag his body back to Thebes. But Theseus, who's the king of Athens, kind of deus ex machinas Oedipus out of the entire situation and just tells Creon essentially to go screw off. And I think it's worth noting, too, that this play, as outlined in the introduction, it's a play of arrivals, or in other words, Oedipus doesn't really move. He's just visited by all of these characters who show up, and then they frustrate him with various arguments. which Oedipus generally eschews with his something like a wisdom of old age, though it's worth noting that Oedipus feels anything but the role of the respected elder, as his sons refuse to heed even a word of his advice and just scream at him when he doesn't give them the advice that they want. So there's Polynices, who is Oedipus' son, who had earlier betrayed his father when he exiled him from Thebes. Way back in Oedipus the King, and he was more concerned with power and influence than his own father. And so he shows up in this play and he's pleading for his father's blessing in a battle with his brother Eteocles. But Oedipus shows pretty much zero sympathy for his sons and tells him that he has been fated to commit fratricide and die by the same hand in battle for Thebes. Oedipus then dies some like weird, mysterious death where he's like spirited away into the heavens and he's like seemingly forgiven and embraced by the gods. Oedipus's daughters, Antigone and Ismene, plan to head back to Thebes. And that's kind of the whole play. It's, somewhat uneventful, to be honest. I found this play to be the least interesting, though I think it's an important conclusion and counterpart to the chaos and suffering of Oedipus the King proper. And it finds Oedipus in like what I'd call like heroic old man mode, where he has to some extent accepted his fate. It's worth noting that he doesn't totally accept it, as he argues with Theseus that he didn't have control over his fate and therefore he's not like totally responsible for it. So he kind of finds it out there. But in general, he's just kind of accepted his fate. He's accepted his life for what it is, and he's just looking for a respectable transition into the afterlife, and the gods themselves have forgiven him. And so we should look at Oedipus as a kind of respectable role model as to like what to do about the fact that we have no control over our fate, and when we even after we commit pretty deplorable actions. All right, so the play points at the play points at like this familial curse, right? So it's not just Oedipus who receives a terrible curse. It's also his sons. It's also his daughters. It's his parents. There is a curse that is working through the entire lineage of the family. And though I haven't like read any scholarly discourse on how this plays into modern psychology, I thought it was really interesting how the sons have this inability to seek forgiveness for the sins of their father, and all this plays out in really dramatic fashion in Antigone, which is also going to cause grave destruction to Creon and Thebes as a city. And also there's something like a simplicity in this play throughout that, in my opinion, makes it the least interesting of the plays. Sophocles wrote this play later in life, and it really reads like an honest wrestling with his past, with Sophocles' past, and attempting to find an honorable death. In some of our early research in the classroom, turns out that apparently Sophocles died either excitingly reciting some lines from Antigone or choking on food. All right, now there is the last play in this trilogy. I would call this, as my students might say, it's a true banger of a play. It's definitely the best in the trilogy. And this play, unlike Oedipus the King and Oedipus the Colonus, focuses on politics and the individual's relationship to the state at large. And the play opens with Antigone, who again is Oedipus's daughter. And she's like this proto-feminist heroine, and she's attempting to hold a ceremonial burial for her recently deceased brother, Polynices. Eteocles, his brother, because he was defending Thebes, was given full ceremonial rights. And at this point, Creon, who is now the king of Thebes, represents the state and threatens to punish Antigone with death for breaking the law. However, it's quite clear from both the chorus's response and Hymen's retorts against his father's purely rational analysis that Creon is pretty much overstepping a boundary and putting the state above the gods. And that's kind of like the moral argument that's going on throughout the course of this play, like law versus morality. So I thought what made this play interesting is that the themes most closely align with our modern sensibilities. And so Creon isn't necessarily an evil character, though he could be depicted as such. In the introduction to Antigone, the author writes about how Creon was viewed as a Hitler-esque character during World War II when this play was depicted, though it's not necessary to depict him as such. And his position is technically rational, but his narrow-mindedness and adherence to like total law offends both the Grecian and modern sensibilities. I mean, just this week, the CEO of United Healthcare was murdered in broad daylight in downtown Manhattan, and this shooter is obviously in the legal wrong, but there is like an outcry of Americans who sympathize with his vigilantism. Some feel, in fact, that the CEO's actions resulted in the death of thousands because he rejected so many reasonable claims, and that his subsequent murder is, in fact, no tragedy at all. I also thought while reading this about civil disobedience and how civil disobedience itself is often traced back to the great Henry David Thoreau, but in fact, I think you can really find its roots here in Antigone. Also, I thought that Antigone is definitely the most likable character in this trilogy, and despite the 2,500 years that separate us from her, she feels like the most like fully fleshed out and real character. So, in general, just some thoughts on this text. I thought that the experience of reading Sophocles is very interesting. It's very different from reading a playwright like Shakespeare that I find more akin to like reading really good poetry. It reminds me of the premise of Richard Dawkins' most recent book, which is called The Genetic Book of the Dead, in which he argues that you can read the DNA of a creature and discover about its environment and like all of the environmental pressures on that organism. It's kind of like reading bas relief. And I found that reading Sophocles is pretty similar. That the words themselves are kind of like the DNA, and you can like posit the social and environmental limitations imposed on the people of Greece at the time. And it also highlights, I think, just how little we've changed as a species. These characters are so true to who we are today. And so Sophocles, I now find, is like the bedrock, not just of Western literature, but the bedrock of Western culture as a whole. The questions of free will and responsibility, power, morality, and meaning are brought to the fore in all of these like really climactic arguments. That's what Sophocles loves to do, is have his characters like embody a philosophy and just go at it against one another. And it makes for like, I mean, in my opinion, maybe not my students, a pretty thrilling read at times. Also, there's some real wisdom in these plays, primarily exhibited by Tiresias, who's like the blind guy who can see stuff that you can't, and the elder Oedipus and Antigone, who again is like that proto-feminist character, and they all serve as kind of like models of human behavior amidst the chaos. So in the end, even if you haven't read Sophocles, even if you choose not to read Sophocles, the ideas embedded in this book will find you, but still read it. All right, so that is my brief review of Sophocles' The Three Theban Plays. If you wouldn't mind, if you like this video, please subscribe below, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.